Welcome to the 2024 K-State Garden Hour webinar series. We are so glad that you are all here today on this beautiful March day. This webinar originally started in 2020 and has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. Since the start of the program, we have reached over 50,000 gardeners just like you. We are pleased to continue offering the K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you have enjoyed these educational webinars, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support the program. The link to donate can be found in the chat or on the K-State Garden Hour website. This webinar is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Calla Edwards. I am the horticulture agent for K-State Research in Butler County, based out of El Dorado. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline, but most of all, we each have a love for educating and sharing important gardening topics. Before we get started today, we have a couple housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. This is where our Q&A moderator will look for questions at the end of the webinar for our host to answer. You should see a button along the bottom tab that says Q&A. Click on that and you'll be able to enter your question. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and we will post it to the K-State Garden Hour website typically tomorrow. We also typically upload any additional resources related to the topics as well as links that have been shared in the chat. Our website is where you can also access previous topics and see the upcoming topics for the 2024 series. Our moderators today are Abby Drott and Jesse Gilmore. They will be sharing information in the chat and then also working with the Q&A feature to answer questions. If you have any other questions related to Zoom, please use the chat feature for those. Today's topic is selecting and planting fruit trees for Kansas. We have two speakers today. One speaker is Rebecca McMahon. She is the Local Foods Program Administrator for Kansas. And our other speaker is Anthony Reardon. He is the Small Farms Horticulture Agent for Johnson County. Please give us just a couple minutes as we transition slides and get started with our program today.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Garden Hour talk on fruit tree selection and planting. As Calla said, I'm Rebecca McMahon, and I'm the Local Food System Program Administrator for K-State Research and Extension. And I live down here in Wichita, Kansas. I've been here for about 16 years now. And I'm excited to share with you some of the things that I've learned about fruit tree selection, especially for our Kansas environment. I know that there's many of you joining from other states. So, as always, just understand that some of the things I'm talking about may or may not be relevant to your local conditions, and you may want to look for more localized resources in that regard. So we started out with a quick poll about what fruit trees you're most excited to learn about. And it looks like most of you are pretty interested in the common fruit trees. I'm not going to take the time to share those results. And one of my hosts, did we end up getting this poll put in?
Yep.
Okay, so I want to do another quick poll before we kind of jump into our basics about what factors you are currently considering when you select your fruit tree varieties.
These were in the welcome poll.
Were they? Okay, I didn't look at the results on that one. Awesome. Okay. So it looks like some of you are considering disease resistance, cold hardiness, tree size, and things like that, as well as local availability or not being sure. Okay, awesome. Okay, so our plan for today, I'm doing the first part and then Anthony's going to talk about planting. So what we're going to cover in the first half of the presentation is just some basic information about fruit trees. We're going to talk about general considerations for fruit tree selection, and then we are going to go pretty quickly through some more specific information on certain types of fruit trees. So my goal, based on what most of you are interested in, is we're going to spend most of our time on general concepts and then our basic fruits: apples, pears, peaches, cherries. And then if we've got a little bit more time before I hand it off to Anthony, we are going to talk about a couple of our less common fruits. So our common fruit trees, as we kind of said, are apples, pears, cherries, peaches, and plums. Those are the fruits that have typically been found to be most successful in Kansas, although there's definitely some variation between them, depending on the part of the state you're in, your soil conditions, and so forth. One of the things, if you've tried growing fruit in Kansas and maybe not been super successful, you've realized is that growing fruit in Kansas can be a pretty challenging thing. Lots of different reasons behind that. Part of it is just our environment here on the plains can have lots of extremes. So we have frequently late spring frosts. So, we're just kind of getting to that window where with some of this warm weather, some of our fruit trees are starting to bud out a little bit. And anywhere from now until fruit set, until fruit are well set and into early May, there's this chance of late spring frosts that are going to, or freezes, that are going to damage our fruiting buds and compromise the ability of our fruit trees to produce. So late spring frosts are a really big factor in success of getting good fruit set on most of our fruiting trees, and are often one of the deciding factors in whether or not something is even worth planting in Kansas. We also tend to have rapid temperature changes. Just last week here in Wichita, we went from, something ridiculous like 82 down to 22 in, about 6 hours. Those sorts of temperature swings, especially in the fall, can be really hard on trees and really hard on our fruit trees. We do have some cold winter temperatures, although they're not nearly as cold as other places in the US. Some of our common fruits are perfectly hardy to our winter temperatures. Others, like peaches and plums, are maybe not quite as winter hardy. More concerning, we do tend to have high pH soils. A lot of the state has fairly heavy clay soils, and so our soil conditions can be difficult for our fruit trees as well. Parts of the state, depending on the season and the summer, can have high summer humidity, which makes diseases a real challenge. And then kind of a little bit of a positive and negative, we have a long growing season. So we have 160 to 190 growing days across the state of Kansas. However, so that means that we can get some longer season fruit crops producing, but that also has the downside of lots of generations of insects. So some of our challenging insects to control, because we have such a long growing season, we can end up with 2 or even 3 generations of things like codling moth, which makes fruit production a little bit more challenging. The next thing I want to talk about in terms of fruit trees is pollination. So I've got this chart here, and we're gonna, if you're not quite sure what I mean when I say self-pollinated or cross-pollinated, I'm gonna go into that in a little more detail. But when we're looking at our basic fruits, some of the things that we need to take into consideration is what is the pollination requirements so that we get fruit set. And our apples and pears generally require cross-pollination, as do sweet cherries and Japanese plums. Peaches and nectarines, as well as tart cherries and European plums are generally more self-pollinated. So what do those terms mean? What does that mean when you're thinking about planting a fruit tree? Cross-pollination is where for fruit set to occur, the flower has to be pollinated with pollen from a different variety of tree or a different cultivar. So what that means is I've got my 2 apple trees here on the screen. You can sit here and look at them. And if I have, for example, 2 Honeycrisp apple trees, they are genetically identical and they cannot cross-pollinate. So the bees can fly back and forth between those 2 Honeycrisp apple trees to their heart's content, and it's not going to result in fruit set because the pollen is not genetically different. So you have to have 2 different varieties. So we're not saying like you need an apple and a plum. We're saying you need, like, for instance, a Honeycrisp apple and a Gala apple, or 2 different cultivars of fruit trees in that same species to get cross-pollination. So if we go back to our chart here, apples require cross-pollination. And there's really not any exceptions with apples. One of the things people ask a lot is, will crab apples pollinate fruiting apples? And the answer is yes. In most cases, they will. And then pears are also typically cross-pollinated. You see the asterisks on this table. The asterisks mean that there are certain varieties that are exceptions to the rule. So folks often like to say, oh, but I have this XYZ variety and it doesn't require cross-pollination. That's entirely possible. There are some exceptions in the realm of pears. But typically, if a fruit requires cross-pollination, even if there's a self-pollinating variety, it tends to produce higher quality, more plentiful fruit if it has cross-pollination. So pears fall into that category. Sweet cherries fall into that category. There are starting to be a few sweet cherry varieties that are self-pollinating. But like, honestly, I've even found that tart cherries sometimes do better with a little bit of cross-pollination. So I would guess that would be the case with our sweet cherries that are supposedly fully self-fertile or self-pollinating. And then Japanese plums. So we'll kind of distinguish between Japanese and European plums a little bit later. So our self-pollination is a case where you don't require 2 different varieties. You don't even require 2 different trees. So all you really need in the case of self-pollinating fruit is a single tree, a single variety of that fruit. So, this peach tree here, our happy little bee can just fly around to the flowers from all of those different trees. So again, that's our peaches and nectarines. I didn't put it on the chart, but most apricots fall into that category. And then tart cherries fall into the self-pollinated category, and European plums, most of them are technically considered self-pollinating, but I think most folks feel that they do set better fruit with some cross-pollination. So that's the basics of pollination, and that's going to be really important when we start thinking about fruit tree selection and variety selection. The other thing that, and I kind of alluded to it when I mentioned that most of the time our fruit trees, like if you have 2 different Honeycrisp apple trees, they're genetically identical. The reason for that is that 99% of the time, fruit trees are grafted. They're propagated by grafting, which is a vegetative process. So it means that a nursery took a cutting of a Honeycrisp apple tree and they grafted it onto a rootstock. And so it doesn't change the genetics of the top part, which is sometimes called the scion. So it doesn't change that those genetics, you still have all of the characteristics of the fruit variety, and then it's grafted onto a rootstock for several different purposes. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the rootstocks. So one of the things that I tend to get questions like, my kids even love it. Like my kids are even all about like, oh, can I plant this peach pit, or can I plant this mango pit, or, so on and so forth. Is planting seeds of fruit trees is not a good way to get a plant with a specific characteristic of the fruit that you want it to have. It can be fun, but you're not going to end up with anything that is necessarily looking like the fruit that it came out of. So most of our fruit trees that we're purchasing have already been grafted by the nursery. So I mentioned the word rootstocks. The rootstock is the term for when they do that grafting process for the bottom part, the root part of that plant. And there are actually breeders that develop very specific rootstocks for different conditions and do different sorts of things. And so our rootstocks on our fruit plants can impact the overall mature size of the tree, the hardiness of the root system to different temperature conditions, as well as tolerance of different soil conditions. So apples tend to have by far the most rootstock options out there, but there are some different rootstock options for different types of fruits. And you can sometimes find rootstocks that are more tolerant to a high soil pH, so an alkaline soil pH, which could be really beneficial for us in Kansas, or that are tolerant of wet soil conditions or dry soil conditions. So those are things that you might consider, might want to think about if you are wanting to, say, plant an apple tree on an old farmstead that doesn't have irrigation. You don't want it to have to be watered consistently. You may look for a variety and a rootstock that's a little more tolerant of dry soil conditions. Whereas if you're planting your fruit tree in, an urban landscape and you're irrigating your lawn all the time and you have heavy clay soil, you may actually want a rootstock that's a little more tolerant of wet soil conditions. And of course, there's rootstocks that are good for all different types of soil conditions. The one thing about rootstock that is most commonly known, though, is that it tends to change the mature size of the tree. So I kind of like this chart that you see on the screen. It's not comprehensive by any means, but it shows different rootstocks. And rootstocks don't have pretty names. They just have these funky number letter code names. But it shows the percentage of dwarfing that they confer onto the scion or the cultivar. So like a seedling tree is at that 100%, and then these different rootstocks might dwarf it by 10% for like that 90% tall tree, or all the way down to the M27 rootstock, which is very dwarf and is 20% of the size of that original seedling tree. So you can get some pretty neat, pretty dwarf trees with some different rootstocks. And that's particularly for apples. There aren't near as many choices in some of our other fruit tree categories. While we're on the topic of grafting and rootstocks, I do want to spend a minute talking about fruit salad trees or fruit cocktail trees. Those are things that you often see in catalogs or on the internet or things like that. And it's a situation where they have grafted multiple varieties onto a single rootstock. And in general, what I would tell you about those is that you can have some challenges with graft compatibility, meaning all of the different varieties may not be as successful on that particular rootstock as the others are. So that can sometimes cause a challenge. If you have varieties that ripen at different times, that can be a challenge for maintenance practices like spraying or harvest and things like that. And also different cultivars, when grafted on, may have different levels of vigor and productivity. So you can end up with a tree that's kind of lopsided, because one variety grows really big and another variety is not nearly as vigorous. So all of those are kind of concerns. I will also say, like, if you have a fruit salad tree that has different species of fruit on it, particularly like apples and pears or apples and peaches or things like that. Someone is trying to con you because they fruit trees don't work that way. So you could have a fruit salad tree with like multiple apple varieties or multiple pear varieties, but having both apples and pears on the same tree is most likely not going to be successful at all. With our prunus species, with like peaches and plums and cherries, and nectarines, it's a little more possible, but it's still really difficult. So maybe, if you want something like this, try to stick to the same species of fruit on a tree and give it a try. But do be aware it may not be a good choice because of these other factors. So a few terminology things that you might see when you're doing some research on fruit trees is also related to tree size. So we mentioned that with the rootstocks, and the rootstocks are what's conferring that different size onto the tree in most cases. And usually the terms you're going to see are dwarf or semi-dwarf, or semi or standard in some way. So a standard is typically close to, if not full size, what the tree would be. Semi-dwarf is usually, a partial dwarfing, and then that full dwarf is, typically less than 50% of the normal size, the normal tree size. There are also starting to be, particularly with apples, some columnar trees, so trees that are much more upright. There's always all kinds of new and interesting things coming out in that regard. So things that you may be interested in trying and seeing how they do for you in your yard. So overall, when we start thinking about our fruit tree selection and our factors of consideration, we do want to think about that mature tree size, particularly for those of you that are in more urban growing environments. You want to think about how big that tree is going to get and how much space it has. And then I also challenge you to think about the harvest timing, the total yield of a mature tree, like make sure you're prepared for that. And then water and soil requirements, what the pruning and pest control is going to be like, definitely the pollination requirements, and then fruit use, quality is desired, disease resistance, and of course our hardiness and weather tolerance. So I mentioned, being aware of what a full harvest looks like. So these are a couple pictures off of my peach tree last summer. So I've got a friendly little praying mantis that was hanging out with the peaches. So this doesn't look so bad, right? Like, oh, that's not bad. That's a healthy number of peaches. I can manage that. But so this is one peach tree, and it's pruned to keep it fairly small. And so this, by the time it was all said and done, is kind of what the harvest looked like. I think we estimated we had about 5 bushels of peaches, about 250 plus pounds of peaches off of this single tree. So that's, just kind of my friendly word of warning, like be aware that if you're going to plant a fruit tree, to be prepared for what that harvest is going to look like. So I know that we are getting pretty close to the point where Anthony's going to be chomping at the bit. And so I'm going to quickly jump through a little bit of detail on a few of the different specific types of fruit. So apple trees, again, we talked about that they require cross-pollination, which means if you're going to plant an apple, you need 2 varieties, or a fruiting apple variety and a crab apple variety. So in the apple category, there's tons of options. There's this orangepippin.com website has thousands of apple varieties on it. It's really interesting to look at. I'm certainly not advocating using that information to choose a variety, but it's really interesting to see all of these historical varieties. The thing I will tell you about apples is if you see the variety, you see the cultivar in a grocery store, chances are it's not going to grow well in Kansas. And that gets really frustrating for most home gardeners because you're like, oh, but I really like Honeycrisp, or I really like XYZ apple, and then the nursery sells it or the box store sells it. But those varieties tend to have really severe disease challenges in Kansas. And so we want to look for varieties that have resistance to apple scab, fire blight. Cedar apple rust is super critical here in Kansas, and powdery mildew. So some disease-resistant apples, the bolded ones are the ones that have the best disease package for Kansas, that are resistant to typically all 4 of those things, and in particular resistant to cedar apple rust. So you can see some of the other varieties, Crimson Crisp is not resistant to cedar apple rust. Baldwin and Empire are only resistant to cedar apple rust and not apple scab and things like that. So you really want to, especially if you don't want to be spraying with a conventional fungicide on a consistent basis every season, you really want to look at these disease-resistant varieties rather than choosing, that variety that you're familiar with from the grocery store. So pears, just a couple things to highlight with pears. Pears also typically require the cross-pollination, and pears can be really tricky to line up the pollination windows. So when you're looking for varieties, you can't just pick any old 2 pear varieties. You have to make sure that their bloom windows line up so that you get good pollination. And typically ornamental pears do not pollinate fruiting pears because their bloom windows are too far apart. Fire blight is also our #1 problem with pears, and so we want to look for fire blight resistance. So there's starting to be some good options for fire blight resistance with our pear varieties. There's quite a list of European pears, which are maybe what you're more familiar with from the standpoint of that softer flesh. And then the Asian pears, which are typically round fruit and crunchier flesh, there's also starting to be a few more options that are fire blight resistant. And Asian pears are actually nicely heat resistant as well. They can be a little tricky sometimes to find cold hardiness varieties though. Our peaches and nectarines, these guys are a nice switch. They are self-pollinating, so you only need 1 tree. And it's important to note that these trees are much more susceptible to stress compared to apples and pears. They don't live nearly as long. And you want to really carefully research hardiness and cold tolerance. I tend to encourage folks in Kansas to look for late blooming varieties because that's going to give you the best chance of getting a crop in a year when we have late frosts. There's so many things to think about in terms of peach varieties, whether they're clingstone or freestone, the flesh color, flat versus round, melting versus non-melting flesh, meaning how soft the flesh gets at maturity, acid levels. So all kinds of things out there to consider. But in reality, in Kansas, what's most critical is our cold hardiness. So both winter hardiness, looking for a variety that's hardy to zone 5 or 6, depending on your location, and then that late bloom and frost tolerance on the buds, on the flower buds. So you see I bolded Contender. Contender is the variety that I grow. It's the tree I have. It's hardy to zone 4. It's one of the latest blooming varieties. And I suspect it's because it oversets ridiculously. But I tend to have peaches in at least one of the years that most people don't have peaches because of a late freeze. So if we have like 2 years with late freezes, I tend to have at least some peaches in one of those years with Contender. So that's, again, kind of my personal observation down here in Wichita on that variety. Apricots, people like to ask about apricots because they're super delicious when they're nice and fresh. But the flowers are killed by frost about 90% of the time in Kansas. So if you want something other than an ornamental tree, you're looking for late blooming, high chilling hour requirements, frost hardy flowers, and things like that. Cherries, tart cherries and sweet cherries. Tart cherries tend to do pretty well in Kansas. They're naturally small trees, grow up to about 15 feet tall, and tend not to have as many disease or insect challenges as a lot of other fruits. Doesn't mean there aren't some, but they're not typically as problematic. Pretty cold hardy, pretty frost resistant, typically self-pollinating. But of course, most people want to grow sweet cherries, and sweet cherries are a little bit trickier. So they do require cross-pollination, except for a few of our newer varieties. And I'll show that slide here in a minute, but they don't tolerate our weather extremes nearly as well. And most sweet cherries tend to have large trees that don't live very long. So they can be a challenge to grow in Kansas. So some cherry varieties you might consider, the sweet cherries, Black Gold, Stella, and White Gold all have some self-fertile characteristics or ability to self-pollinate, but that doesn't mean you're not going to still deal with cracking and other stress related to weather conditions. Okay, last up is going to be plums, just really quickly. Kind of differentiating between Japanese and European types of plums. So Japanese types are typically what we're used to seeing in the grocery store that are juicier, sweet. European types are blue and are often the ones that we typically buy dehydrated as prunes. So not nearly as juicy in that regard. But so of course, the less likely we are to want to eat them, the more hardy they are for Kansas. It's pretty typical. So Japanese types are typically only hardy to zone 6, and they tend to bloom later or bloom earlier and be more susceptible to those spring frosts compared to our European types. European types can also set some fruit without cross-pollination. And then, of course, we do have lots of American native species. There's not been a whole lot of selection or breeding work done on those. But if you have one, they can be kind of a neat tree to have. Growing up, we had a couple of just American plum species on our farm, and they had little plums that we would take and juice out and make jelly and all kinds of stuff like that. So I think with that, I'm going to pause there and turn it over to Anthony.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Let me get my slides pulled up here. My name is Anthony Reardon. I am the Horticulture Small Farms agent for Johnson County, Kansas. There we are. So we are going to talk about how to plant your fruit trees, because just as important as it is to select them, you have to put them in the right spot in order for them to thrive. And there's several different considerations to keep into mind when you're planting them. That said, if you know how to plant a tree, you're already 90% of the way there, but there are some specific requirements for fruit trees specifically. So when it comes to sunlight, you need to keep in mind that all fruit trees require full sun. That means 6+ hours of direct sunlight per day. This is going to help with photosynthesis, obviously, so it's going to develop food for the tree itself. It's also very critical for fruit bud development. So the buds that make the flowers, that make the fruits, they need that sunlight for them to form. Fruit growth and color is also very closely related to fruit synthesis and fruit growth. When looking at the soil that you are going to be planting in, you need to keep in mind that well-draining soil is an absolute must with fruit trees. They cannot tolerate flooded conditions. So if you do have a high clay soil or something that doesn't drain well, there are going to be amendments that are necessary. This can include French drains, where you have a rock base underneath your planting area where excess water can go to. Drainage tiles are an option in larger operations. Typically, you only see these in farms, but say if you had an orchard, you may be able to do something along those lines. And a drainage tile is just sort of like a pipe that's underground that water can be diverted to. And then I have raised beds here with a question mark because it is an option, but you need to keep in mind fruit trees are big specimens, right? Unless you're growing a dwarf. So you may have a limited level of success just because of how compact the roots are going to have to stay. Organic matter incorporation is going to be your best friend when it comes to changing the composition of your soil to a well-draining soil. And that's because if you have a clay soil, it's going to increase aeration and water infiltration. If you have a sandy soil, it's going to hold the water and increase the nutrients. So in both instances, it's going to help with moisture being in that perfectly right area where it's moist but not overly saturated. When it comes to pH of soil for your fruit trees, generally they're going to enjoy a 6.0 to 6.5 pH, so slightly acidic. Now, they can handle a wide range depending on the type of plants. It can go all the way from 4 to 8.5, depending on what kind of fruit you're working with. But again, most of them like that slightly acidic. And here's a visual representation of that. Your cherries, they can go all the way up to an 8.0 alkaline base. Your apples and blackberries, they go down all the way down to a 5.5 acidic. And then, even our shrubs, which we're not really discussing today because we're sticking to fruit trees, blueberries, they love an acidic soil. So it kind of varies specifically by the plant you're working with. When it comes to adjusting your soil, what we always recommend to people is getting a soil test because it's going to tell you the exact amounts of nutrients you need to apply to your soil to get it to that perfect pH that's going to be that happy zone for the fruits that you're working with. When it comes to taking a soil test, as you can see in this graphic I have here in the middle, there are several circles, but the main areas that you need to be taking samples from would be the four corners of the planting area as well as the center. Now you can take more samples, but they just need to be evenly spaced out so that you're getting an even distribution of the area you're working with. All those samples you would mix together, then a 2-cup portion of that mixture is what you would take into the extension office to then have tested. Now, when you get your test back, if you have an acidic soil, they are going to probably tell you to add ground limestone because that's going to raise your pH. And if you have a alkaline soil, they are going to tell you to add sulfur because that's going to lower your pH. Also, when it comes to soil preparation, this is your time to be incorporating your organic matter. So what you are going to do in that situation is till the area and then work your organic matter in. And then as you work the organic matter in, you want to feather it outward because you are going to have two different types of soil compactness and compositions, right? So your roots, they need to be able to grow from one area to another. If you feather it out, they're going to be able to reach further. After you work it in, till it in again. And then you can consider doing this in the fall time because that is going to give your organic matter time to incorporate into the soil. You can also consider tarping it. And what that is going to do, it's going to help sterilize the soil. So any diseases or insects that are in that particular spot, they are going to essentially be cooked and gotten rid of during the wintertime. The best time to plant fruit trees is in early spring or in late fall if you are planting a dormant tree. So mid-March coming right up, this would be the time to be planting your live trees. Actively growing trees, however, should not be planted any later than April. And that's because you've got a lot of tender growth that is going to be needing accounted for. And you can have a lot of damage that comes up when it comes to fruit buds, etc. If it not planted within these seasons. So until planting, you want to keep your plants in a shady and well-watered area. This specifically is just going to help your plants essentially get through not being in the ground. They're going to be stressed out because they don't have all the nutrients or water available to them. So this is going to keep that root ball moist. When moving them, you want to lift the pot or the root ball by the base. You do not want to lift by the trunk. If you damage the trunk, then your tree is going to be off to a bad start from the get-go because you've got that damage to account for. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when it comes to fruit trees is you're very rarely ever going to find them as a ball and burlap. Most fruit trees are either going to be bare root, which we'll talk about here in a second, or they are going to be in a plastic pot. In any of those instances, you want to cut away the plastic pot. You want to remove as much wire and burlap as possible if you do find a fruit tree that is a burlap tree. And then you're going to work on finding the tree taper. So this is the first root that extends outward from the trunk. As you can see in this top right photo here, it's several inches down, but it's very important to dig down and get to that root taper because all of that buried area is actually trunk area that's not supposed to be underground. If that bark gets damaged or if it rots, it's going to directly affect the tree's health and possibly kill it. So it's a very important step to get that taper exposed. So getting into stem girdling roots here, this is a very important thing to mitigate when it comes to planting any kind of tree. And essentially how this happens, if you want to look down to the bottom photo here, internally what is happening in your plants is you have water moving up through the xylem or the wood, and then you have water moving down through the phloem or the bark. And so this is the reason we protect our bark, because if our bark gets damaged, then you immediately affect the flow of water within the plants. It's not as healthy as it could be otherwise, because remember that sap flow is where all your nutrients are. So your plant isn't being properly watered, it isn't being properly fed if there's damage to that bark. Now, with stem girdling roots, it's still considered a damage because they are wrapping around each other so tightly that they're essentially strangling each other. It's making it so that sap flow cannot happen. Now, does it directly kill your trees? Not always. Here's some photos of larger trees with stem girdling roots. What's important to keep in mind here is that even though the trees are large and they're surviving the stem girdling roots, they are not going to be as healthy as they would be otherwise. And specifically when it comes to your fruit trees, it's very important to remember that nutrients and water are essential for developing fruits. So if you don't have as much nutrients and water moving through your tree as possible, then it's not going to be producing well. This slide always makes me laugh. It reminds me of my arboriculture class in college, where our professor would tell us, now this is an essential step to planting a fruit tree or any kind of tree, but you don't want to do it in front of the homeowner because they're going to accuse you of killing their plants when they see you messing with the roots. And really, when it comes down to it and planting any kind of trees, you have to liberally chop up your root balls. That means detangling all of the roots as much as you possibly can, trying to avoid those fleshier roots, because those are the ones where your tertiary smaller roots are going to develop from. So if you do damage those larger roots, the tree is going to be a little bit less likely to recover from that. Sometimes it will still be necessary if it's a stem girdling root, and you should still get rid of it. When planting the tree itself, you want to plant the root ball so that it is dig the hole for the root ball so it is 3 times the size of the root ball and width. This is going to give ample area for roots to spread. It's also going to help mitigate that bowl effect that you may have if you have very different soil compositions. So when it comes to watering your tree is not just going to be sitting in water. It's going to give room for that water to spread out. When you plant the root ball itself, it should be sitting about 2 to 3 inches above grade. And that's because it's going to give you a little bit of room for the tree to sink. And then it needs to be sitting preferably on solid ground. This means that you really should not be backfilling it, because if you do that, the tree may lean when you plant it and it begins to settle. Another kind of soil test here, after you have your hole dug, you can actually fill it in with water before you plant any kind of plants in there. And this is going to give you an idea of the soil composition you have. If you have a high clay, it's going to take a long time for that water to go away. And then you're going to know that you need to be watering less frequently. Short time a short time for that water to drain would indicate high sand, which means you're going to need to be watering that tree more frequently. So keep that in mind. That's an easy test that you can do on your own. Now, when it comes to planting fruit trees specifically, as Rebecca mentioned, they're generally grafted unless you have a very old variety. They're most likely going to be grafted. And sometimes these grafts are going to be very close to the first root taper. You do not want the graft of the tree buried at all. Even if it is very close to the root taper, that root taper needs to be up above the ground then, and you just need to use the next root taper below it. You do not want these to rot, so it's going to be very essential to keep that graft away from the ground. Now, when it comes to planting bare root trees, there are a few other considerations to take in mind. When you're planting fruit trees or ordering fruit trees, there are a lot of options that will be bare root trees. A very common thing that people will recommend to you is to soak bare root trees in a bucket of water. And this is actually not recommended because it deprives the roots of oxygen. What you want to do is temporarily pot it in moist mulch soil or compost. And this will give the roots, room to breathe, room to absorb moisture, but it won't be suffocating them. Then when you're planting the tree, you want to try to, again, plant it at the first root taper. at least have the hole 2 times the width of the extent of the roots. And then the roots themselves shouldn't be bending as you plant them. So it will be, placed into the hole, and then when you are backfilling, you want to gently tamp around the roots so that it is holding in the plants. There should not be any bare air in the hole, because this is going to be too much air for the plants or for the roots themselves, and it'll actually kill the roots. When backfilling, the most important thing to remember is everything that comes out of the hole should go back in. It is going to settle quite a bit, so you do not want to have that shallow there, because as we mentioned, drainage is a big issue when it comes to fruit trees. If there's too much water in a spot, the tree is going to suffer. So you want the tree to not have a bowl where it's planted. Removing ties and tags is also very critical. A lot of people will try to leave these on so they remember the variety they're working with or something along those lines. But you need to keep in mind that this is going to have the same effect on a tree as a stem girdling root. It's eventually going to girdle that stem and kill that branch. And then you want to hold off on initial pruning. So when a tree is planted, or in general, leaf buds on a tree generates root stimulator hormone. So the more you prune off, the less roots are going to develop on your tree. This is very important to remember, especially during the first year, because the tree is trying to establish and get that hardiness to it. Also, the tree itself, it's already stressed out, or about as stressed as it can be, because of the damage that the roots have taken when you have planted it. So you don't want to add any additional stressors to the tree. So for this reason, you only remove the damaged, dead, and rubbing branches when you first plant a tree for that first year. Now, what is really important to remember when it comes to when it comes to pruning trees, is that fruit buds develop on last year's growth. So everything that grows this year is going to be on buds that formed last year, and all the new growth that happens this year is going to have buds that form the fruit for next year. So it needs to be kept in mind as you prune your trees. You are essentially removing fruits when you do this. When it comes to pruning trees, each tree is going to have its own specific requirements, especially fruit trees. You never, however, want to remove up to 20 to 30% more than what is there in live growth, because if it is more than this, you're going to be stressing out the tree. Now, the things to aim for: disease and infected branches, rubbing branches, weakly attached branches, dual leaders and suckers, and water sprouts. These are all good things to aim for. Just remember, apple trees can largely be composed of water sprouts. So if you remove too much, you're removing all of your fruit. And, even like peaches, something along those lines, their fruits all forms on the very edge of new growth every year. So what you're seeing, or not new growth, but last year's growth, but what you're seeing, very edge of the branches is where the peaches are growing. So if you do not bring your tree in through pruning methods, you are going to have that weight further and further and further out from the base of the tree. Eventually, this can lead to tree splitting. So it's very important, especially with peaches, to prune your trees. As far as tree staking goes, this is something, depending on the area you're in, people may tell you, oh, you really shouldn't do it because it needs to develop a sturdy base. Here in Kansas, it's absolutely necessary. We're on the plains, we have high winds, and we have to account for those winds, particularly the north and south winds is the most important ones to try to accommodate for. So that is where you would be placing your stakes, preferably, and you want to try to use wire or something along those lines, not a wire, but a rope that would be flexible. Wire is specifically not recommended because that can girdle the roots or girdle the stem very easily if you do not take it off in time. And then pad those ties so you're not damaging the bark as the tree tries to move around in the wind. And then when it comes to plant care, keep in mind that you need to stake your trees. Anticipate continually fertilizing your trees. So this will either be with your soil test recommendations. They'll tell you how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are in the soil and what you need to specifically apply for that specific fruit. or something that like a low range fertilizer that's a slow release, like a 13-13-13, will be good for feeding your tree through the season. Utilize rodent guards in the winter. Rodents are going to be looking for a water supply, and often they will go to tree trunks and try, eating through them so they can get that water and that sustenance in the winter when sustenance is short. And then you want to thin your fruit trees as it begins to develop, as the fruit begins to develop. This is going to be for weight management, and it's also going to be reallocating your nutrients of your tree towards desirable fruits. So say you have some damaged fruits, you want to take that off, and then all those nutrients that would be going towards the damaged fruit are going to go towards the non-damaged and have a better product. This is also going to increase the number of fruit buds that you get for next year. Surrounding weed growth is definitely important to keep it under control because it is going to compete for water and sunlight and nutrients and everything else. It's also going to harbor pests, so you don't want those in the area. And then again, after the first year of growth, that is when you can come in and prune your fruit trees. And then lastly here, I just wanted to give a plug for Dig Safe. When you are planting trees, you are generally digging a little bit lower than you would be any other situation. Dig Safe is a free service that has most utilities participating. They will come and free of charge mark any utilities that may be in your area. And this can spare you from very expensive legal liabilities should you have, say, a gas line or electric line or a fiber optic cable in your yard. So with that, I will stop sharing here and we can open up to questions.
All right, Anthony, we've got a couple of good ones in the chat. The first, in the example of girdling roots, how do you remove them and how do you select which roots to remove? And where is it best to eliminate root girdle?
So it's best to remove the girdling roots as the tree is being planted. That's really your only opportunity. If the tree is fully grown, it's too late to go in and remove that roots. Now, if it is a fleshy roots, you can still remove it if it is encircling the tree. But again, those are the ones that you want to try to avoid if you can. If it's a girdling root, however, it needs to go. Any kind of root that is encircling the trunk itself is considered a stem girdling root. So those are the ones you're aiming for.
Okay, next question. What should you do when planting on a slope? Someone planted my peach tree on a slope in my yard and it's sticking out perpendicular. Any suggestions?
I would recommend staking, trying to pull that tree back, like the direction it's supposed to be growing. And then it sounds like, is the root ball itself sticking out of the slope?
I believe I'm not 100% sure on the answer to that.
So depending on if the root ball is exposed, you definitely want those roots underground. You might need to build kind of like a berm around the edge of that just so that you have some level ground around it. And then you need to keep in mind that on a slope, water is going to drain away more quickly. So that tree is going to need water more often than not.
Right. Mary said that the root ball is not sticking out from the soil.
Okay.
Okay. When pruning fruit trees, how do you handle suckering?
So there are some products out there that can handle or can help with suckering. Their reliability is hit and miss. There's one that's called Sucker Punch, which we're not, giving brand names here or trying to recommend one or the other. But there are some that are out there that you can try. Generally, what I've seen is you've got to stay on top of it maintenance-wise, and then also covering it with, say, like a landscape fabric may help a bit with suppressing those shoots. That said, landscape fabric will also inhibit water, so that is something to keep in mind.
Do you have any recommendations for how to keep squirrels off of fruit trees?
I'd look for.
Sorry.
I'd look at what well, okay. I was about to say deter their food source, but I guess the tree itself would be the food source, right? Rebecca, I'll let you take that one.
Thanks, Anthony. I really don't think there is a good method, honestly. Especially if you're in an urban environment with lots of squirrels, or if it's dry and they're looking, usually they're looking for water is what they're looking at. I kind of look at it, you're just going to share some of your fruit.
We did have some questions from earlier on different types of fruits. Real quickly, do you want to touch on citrus at all? Would that succeed in our area? Are there any types of citrus that would be more cold hardy? Lemons were the particular interest of this one question.
So we really don't have great recommendations on citrus. Obviously, citrus are not going to be cold hardy here. Even those of us on the southern part of the state in Zone 7, we're not. Citrus are typically only hardy to Zone 9, best case. There's very few options that are less, that are going to tolerate colder temperatures. So if you really want citrus, your best option is looking at, something that's dwarf, that's containerized, that you can move inside, outside. I've got a really nice lime tree in my dining room right now that's happily blooming away. So anyway, that's what I would say with that is citrus are typically going to have to be highly dwarf, containerized, and have some place to bring them in over the winter.
Gotcha. We talked a little bit about the recommended planting time for fruit trees, but what about fertilization? When is the best time to fertilize fruit trees?
You want me to take that, Anthony?
Yeah, go for it.
So typically with fruit trees, and this is something that's a little different from ornamental trees. Sometimes we fertilize ornamental trees in the fall, but with fruit trees, we really want to only fertilize them in the early spring. So kind of at the time that they're coming out of dormancy is a good time to put fertilizer down. Putting fertilizer down in the fall can encourage them to put growth on when they should be going into dormancy and protecting those fruit buds. So yeah, fertilization early spring.
Gotcha. What are the recommendations or guidelines for putting mulch around fruit trees? Are there any things to keep in mind when putting mulch down?
I would just, keep in mind that the general guidelines for mulching when it comes to trees. You don't want it kept against the trunk of the tree because that's going to instigate rot on the trunk itself or in the bark. Keep it at a 3-inch range of depth because more than that, you're going to inhibit water absorption. But try to have it, what would you say, 2-3 feet out from the base of the tree, Rebecca?
Yeah, the mulching recommendations for like we use with ornamental trees are pretty typical. The one qualifier with the mulching is sanitation. So if you have fruit drop that is due to disease or insects, that's going to get into that mulch, so you want to be really thoughtful about your sanitation with that mulch as well.
Let's see. Do you recommend columnar trees that stay smaller? Are they more susceptible to diseases and or pests because of their form?
So columnar trees, mostly what you're going to find are columnar trees that are in the apple category. There's not very many columnar options other than apples. I do have a couple columnar apples that I've tried. I don't know that I'd necessarily wholeheartedly recommend them. And I think, this is kind of a good general note is all of these new varieties and cultivars and cool things that are coming out. We don't have recent research in Kansas. We don't have any research program on fruit trees. So with the columnar trees, I don't know that we have good understanding of if they are going to be more or less disease or insect resistant. Do your due diligence, look and see what they're rated at as far as disease resistance is, and kind of make your decision. I think the trade-off you make with that columnar tree is that it's a smaller tree, it's an easier form maybe to spray, and so it's not as difficult to spray if you need to when it doesn't have resistance.
And I think the last question we can get to right now, any recommendations on serviceberry as a smaller fruit tree?
I don't know that I have cultivar recommendations. You know, they're native plants that are fairly hardy, you know, so I think they'd be worth researching and considering.
All right. Thank you to Rebecca and Anthony for a wonderful presentation today. We typically have more questions than we have time for, but we will be sure to link several articles related to this session to our website. We hope these resources will help answer your questions, but if you need additional information or horticultural questions answered, please contact your local K-State Extension office. Once again, thank you for joining the K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We are so glad you could be here today learning about selecting and planting fruit trees for Kansas. We are excited to continue offering this webinar series in 2024. Be watching your email for more details coming soon about upcoming events. You can visit the K-State Garden Hour website to view recorded Garden Hour archives or to make a tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of this webinar series. This session was recorded and will be posted to the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you will receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out as we greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. Thank you guys again, and we hope you'll join us the first Wednesday of every single month. Have a great rest of your week.